Hi, thank you for listening to this presentation, Patterns of Physical Activity, Stress, and Coping, and Associations with Depression Symptoms in Young Adults, a latent class approach. My name is Melissa deJonge, and I'm a second-year PhD student from the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Before I start, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Kathleen Sabiston, the team of researchers from the Mental Health and Physical Activity Research Center, as well as Dr. Jennifer O'Loughlin and the ENDIT research team for their support with this study. Young adulthood represents a critical life stage when symptoms of poor mental health and diagnosable mental health challenges and illnesses most often emerge. For example, while the burden of mental illness is evident across the lifespan, the majority of diagnosable conditions have their peak onset during adolescence and young adulthood, typically by the age of 24. As such, the development of interventions that prevent the emergence of mental illness among young adults is a growing public health concern. The causes and emergence of mental health concerns among young adults are generally accepted as not only complex, multiple, and interactive, but as of yet also poorly understood. Because of this, there's increasing interest in integrative and comprehensive mental health intervention approaches that seek to explore interrelations between biological, psychosocial, and cultural factors and their associated impact on mental health outcomes. Of relevance to the current study, psychosocial factors, including stress and coping, are suggested to interact with behavioral factors, including engagement and health risk behaviors. For example, stress is associated with poor health behaviors, including engagement in less physical activity. Comparatively, engagement in physical activity has also been identified as a strategy to cope with stress and manage symptoms associated with poor mental health. While it is likely that physical activity, stress, and coping are interrelated and interact to produce unique effects on mental health, most research does not consider the potential of such interrelationships. As such, the aim of the present study was to investigate whether physical activity, stress, and coping cluster in meaningful ways, and whether these clusters differ in depression symptoms among a sample of young adults. Specifically, the primary purpose of the current study was to use a latent class analysis to examine patterns of stress, coping, and moderate to vigorous physical activity among young adults, and whether class membership differ in depression symptoms. A cross-sectional analysis was conducted using data from the 21-year longitudinal nicotine dependence in teens study, also known as the ENDIT study. The sample consisted of 604 young adults, ranging in age from 18 to 24 years. The sample was 50% female and predominantly self-identified as white. The measures used to assess moderate to vigorous physical activity, stress, coping, and depression symptoms are presented in the table on the screen here. In terms of the analysis used, a latent class analysis was conducted in RStudio using the Polka package. Latent classes were calculated based on the posterior probability that cases belong to each latent class. Following the estimation of the latent classes, mean differences in depression scores between the latent classes were analyzed using a univariate ANOVA. Table 2 presented on the screen here displays descriptive statistics and correlation coefficients between main study variables. The correlations were in the expected strength and direction, where higher levels of engagement and moderate to vigorous physical activity was significantly correlated with lower scores of stress, more favorable coping, and lower depression scores. Furthermore, stress and coping were significantly correlated, where higher levels of stress were associated with less favorable coping. Gender was significantly negatively correlated with moderate to vigorous physical activity and positively correlated with coping, stress, and depression. Lastly, there was no significant association between age, moderate to vigorous physical activity, stress and coping, and depression symptoms. Based on model fit evaluation procedures for latent class analysis, a two-class model was identified. The first class represented 39% of the sample and was labeled a high-risk class. This high-risk class was classified by a greater risk for not engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity, reporting high stress, and were more likely to report less favorable coping. The second class represented 61% of the sample and was labeled a low-risk class. Individuals in this class were less likely to report being insufficiently active and exhibited lower stress and more favorable coping. Interestingly, females were more frequently classified in the high-risk group than the low-risk group. A univariate ANOVA indicated symptoms of depression were significantly higher among individuals in the first class compared to the second class. Taken together, health risk behaviors, including physical inactivity, can affect stress and coping outcomes among young adults. Yet their interrelationships and associations with mental health outcomes are poorly understood. In the context of the current study, novel findings are provided that support the clustering of moderate to vigorous physical activity, stress, and coping. Furthermore, the findings suggest that patterns of physical activity, stress, and coping may also be associated with depression symptoms. These findings provide support for using latent class analysis as an approach for determining behavioral profiles for further understanding how modifiable health risk behaviors, including physical activity, may cluster with psychosocial factors, including stress and coping. In turn, this information may be useful for tailoring mental health interventions to target these behavioral profiles. Future research in this area of inquiry would align well with research supporting a need to advance our understanding of multimodal intervention approaches that account for interrelations between factors known to impact mental health outcomes. For example, there's a push towards holistic intervention approaches that target the physical health and mental health of individuals with mental health concerns. Despite the strengths of the current study, the findings need to be interpreted in light of several limitations, including self-selection bias and cross-sectional relationships. Future work is needed to understand whether associations would differ longitudinally over time and whether the results would generalize to other populations, including less active populations and more diverse groups. So for example, across race, gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, as well as whether or not the results would generalize to individuals with more severe mental health concerns. To conclude, this integrative conceptualization of behavioral and psychosocial risk factors for the development of mental health concerns provides implications for further exploring multimodal approaches for promoting mental health and wellness among young adults. From this perspective, and based on empirical evidence, it is quite possible that better clinical mental health outcomes could be achieved from interventions that target both behavioral risk factors, including physical activity, and psychosocial risk factors, including stress and coping. Nonetheless, this research is in a preliminary stage, and future work is needed to further explore associations between stress, coping, physical activity, and mental health outcomes among young adults. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions either here, or you can feel free to email me at the provided email here, melissa.deJonge@utoronto.ca.